I feel the ground tremble beneath my boots as if something enormous is shifting just out of sight, the air vibrating with a low hum that pulses against my ribs, and I'm stumbling forward through the narrow corridor with the trembling beam of my flashlight carving shaky slices through the darkness that seems to lean in around me like it's breathing, pressing, waiting. The ceiling above groans, dust drifting down in lazy spirals that catch the light before vanishing into the thick gloom, and every instinct in me screams to stop, to turn back, but my legs keep moving because I've already crossed some invisible line, stepped too deep into whatever this is, and the silence in front of me feels too full, as if something is listening, calculating, deciding what to do with me. My heartbeat is a frantic metronome in my ears, drowning out my thoughts, but even through that pounding rush I catch faint sounds, dry whispers scraping along the walls, a distant metallic clatter that echoes like a dropped chain, a low rumble that feels more like a growl swallowed by distance than any structural shift. The smell hits me next, sharp and metallic, tinged with something sweet and rotten that clings to the back of my throat, and it reminds me of a morgue drawer cracked open in the dead of night, of something that should have stayed sealed. I drag a sleeve across my mouth, forcing my breathing quiet even though the air feels too thick, like it's resisting me, and then I catch the faint flicker of movement far ahead, a shadow sliding across the end of the hall with a fluidness that doesn't match any human shape, and my grip tightens around the recorder in my other hand even though I don't remember raising it. The red light is blinking, steady and calm in a way I'm not, blinking like a heartbeat separate from mine, and I wonder distantly if it's picking up the low hum thrumming through the floor or the faint vibrating thread in the air that keeps brushing against my skin like an invisible fingertip. My voice is lodged somewhere deep in my chest, and even if I could force it out, I know I wouldn't speak because the silence feels like a deal I'm not allowed to break. The flashlight catches the peeling paint along the wall, long claw-like scratches buried beneath it, and the beam stutters as if the light itself is recoiling from what it's revealing. I keep moving, each step measured, deliberate, my boot sinking slightly into the damp floor as though something underneath is shifting, giving way, and then tightening again around the soles. The corridor seems longer now, stretching impossibly, the angles slightly off, subtly bending like the whole place is breathing around me, and a pressure builds behind my eyes, a faint ringing that rises and falls with each step, almost rhythmic, almost alive. A gust of cold air brushes past me from behind even though the hall is sealed, and my spine stiffens as the temperature drops so sharply my fingertips go numb around the flashlight. Something clicks behind me, sharp and deliberate, like a fingernail tapping the metal doorframe, and I don't turn. Every instinct says that turning is the mistake, that whatever is waiting behind me only matters if I acknowledge it. My pulse hammers faster, my breath fogging in front of me now, each exhale a pale ghost drifting upward and dissolving into the dark overhead. I taste copper, sharp and sudden, and realize I've bitten the inside of my cheek hard enough to draw blood, grounding myself with the sting, the familiar tang reminding me that I'm still here, still anchored, even as the hallway seems to twist subtly with every blink. The shadow at the far end moves again, closer this time, smoother than before, as though it has decided that I've earned a closer look. My flashlight sputters, dims for a heartbeat, and in that fraction of darkness I feel something brush against my shoulder. Light, cold, curious, and my entire body locks, breath caught in my throat like a stone. When the beam flares back to life, I'm already moving faster. Not running, not yet, but the line between control and panic is thinning, trembling like a frayed wire ready to snap. The walls feel narrower now, closing in. The scratches along them deeper, fresher, as though carved moments before I arrived, and every echo of my footsteps comes back distorted, delayed, too many layers of sound for one person walking alone. A distant thud reverberates through the structure, like something heavy shifting its weight, and the floor vibrates beneath me again, stronger this time, enough to send a shiver up my spine and force my breath into short, sharp bursts. The hum in the air intensifies, resonating with my bones, threading through my thoughts, and for a moment I feel a pull, subtle but undeniable, like the darkness itself is reaching for me, coaxing, inviting, waiting. I swallow hard, tasting fear and metal and the cold bite of the unknown pressing closer, and I keep walking because stopping feels like surrender, and surrender feels like the last mistake I'll ever make. I keep my voice level now, steadying it the way I steady my hands when I jot down field notes, letting the memory settle in slow layers as I retraced the path back to where it all began, to the moment the whole thing first brushed against my life with that faint electric wrongness I only recognized in hindsight. It was late afternoon when the call came in, sunlight hanging low and syrup thick over the city, turning the windows of the opposite building into a grid of dull gold squares. I remember staring at them for a few seconds after picking up the receiver, wondering why the light felt colder than it should have. The voice on the other end didn't shake, didn't crack, didn't betray anything except a kind of strained politeness, the practiced tone of someone who spent too long rehearsing what to say and still can't get it right. And even before they reached the part about wanting to hire me, I could hear something beneath the words, a tightness, a hollow in the rhythm, a silence they were trying not to let spill out. They didn't give me details, not really, just the outline of a situation that didn't fit neatly into any of my usual categories, and the way they paused before answering simple questions made my skin prickle with a faint, unwelcome sense of recognition, like I'd heard that kind of silence before, in places I'd rather forget. I agreed to meet them out of curiosity at first, or at least that's what I told myself, but if I'm honest, something in their voice tugged at me, a subtle but insistent pull, the kind that makes you lean closer without realizing you're doing it. The cafe they chose was tucked between a shuttered bookstore and a vacant office plastered with dusty for lease signs, the kind of street where the air always feels a little thinner, as if people don't breathe as much there. I spotted them immediately, sitting alone near the back, posture too straight, fingers wrapped around a cup that had long since gone cold, eyes fixed on the door like they expected someone else to walk in behind me. They weren't trembling, but there was a tension around the shoulders, a stiffness that suggested they'd been holding themselves together long enough for it to become habit. When they looked at me, it was quick, searching, almost hopeful, and then immediately clouded by something I couldn't name. They introduced themselves, voice low, steady, but too careful, each word nudged into place as though the wrong one might cause something to crack open. They explained why they'd sought me out, at least, they explained the part they could put into words, or the part they wanted me to hear, and I listened, taking in a measured tone, the way their gaze kept drifting to the window behind me, tracking something in the glass that wasn't there. It wasn't the story itself that unsettled me. I've heard stranger, and most of the time the truth behind such cases turns out to be painfully ordinary, a pattern of human fear wearing the mask of something bigger. No, what got to me was the feeling that the edges of their recollection didn't line up, like there were seams showing beneath the surface, places where memory had been tugged at or smoothed over with too much intention. They described the situation in broad strokes, but every now and then they'd hesitate mid-sentence, searching for a word that didn't exist, or glancing around with a quick flick of the eyes, the kind someone uses when they think they're being watched but can't explain why. Outside, the street looked normal enough, pedestrians passing, a delivery truck idling at the curb, a dog tugging its owner toward a lamppost, but something in the light felt off again, too pale, too thin, as if the sun had retreated a few steps without telling anyone. I asked a few questions, careful ones, circling the gaps rather than pressing into them, and their answers formed a shape that was coherent only at a distance, like a figure seen through fog. You can tell it's there, you can sense the outline, but the details dissolve the moment you try to focus. My first impressions weren't conclusions so much as fleeting brushstrokes, an unease in the way they whispered certain names, a tremor of relief when I said I'd take the case, a shadow in their expression when I mentioned following up alone. The whole time, I had the sense they already knew more than they were sharing, but not in the usual guarded client way. This felt different, as though there were pieces they genuinely couldn't push into language without risking something unraveling. When our meeting ended, they stood a little too fast, steadied themselves with a hand on the table, and offered a brief nod before slipping out into the dimming light. I watched them walk down the narrow street, their figure thinning with distance, and for a split second, just long enough for doubt to catch my breath, I could have sworn the shadows stretched toward them as they passed, like the darkness was quietly taking note. That was the moment I should have listened to the quiet voice at the back of my mind, the one telling me there was more here than misfortune or misunderstanding, but I filed the feeling away, the way I always do, and returned to my office with the lingering certainty that the case hadn't found me by accident. The days that followed slipped into each other like mismatched cards shuffled by a hand that didn't care about order, and the deeper I went into the case, the more the edges of everything seemed to fray, as if the threads I pulled only revealed more knots beneath them. I combed through witness notes, cross-referenced timelines, revisited the client's account until the cadence of their pauses looped in my mind like a half-forgotten song. But every direction I turned collapsed into another dead end, another misstep, another faint trail that dissolved the moment I got close enough to touch it. I told myself it was just fatigue, that the late hours and stale coffee were catching up to me. But even then I could feel something else creeping underneath the frustration, a slow tightening in the gut, a silent pressure that made the city feel smaller, its corners darker, its echoes a little too sharp. Each time I retraced the client's movements, I found tiny inconsistencies that shouldn't have mattered. An unlit corridor where the light should have been automatic, a maintenance report filed on a day no one actually worked, a door that was supposed to stay locked yet swung open with barely a touch. But each one brought with it a faint shiver of recognition, like reading a sentence written in a language I'd never learned but somehow half remembered. I followed a lead into the archives one night, convinced I'd missed something obvious, only to discover that the folder I needed wasn't misfiled but removed entirely, the empty space on the shelf too clean, too deliberate, and when I asked the clerk the next morning they swore they'd never seen it, their voice flat in a way that made my skin crawl. Another trail led me to a storage facility on the edge of town where the lights flickered in a slow rhythmic pulse, and for a moment, in the hum between each flicker, I felt watched, not by a person but by the building itself, as though I had inhaled and wasn't quite done exhaling. I knew something was wrong long before I found the security logs, blank entries where data should have been, timestamps that shifted by seconds each time I looked at them, a small oscillation that didn't belong in any digital record. And the more I stared at those hollow frames, the more it felt like something was staring back. I started making mistakes, small ones at first, mixing notes between interviews, misremembering conversations, losing track of the order in which I'd visited certain locations. Once, I returned to the client's apartment to compare a few details and found myself standing outside the wrong building entirely, my breath fogging in the air even though the night wasn't cold enough for it. The client noticed the strain before I did. I saw it in the way they hesitated to meet my eyes, as though afraid I'd bring something back with me each time I left the field. Their posture was sharper now, their voice thinner, and there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when I caught the reflection of their face in the window and it didn't seem to match the angle of their real expression, as if the glass lagged behind their movements by a fraction of a second. It wasn't until I retraced the timeline for what felt like the 100th time that something shifted. I was staring at a photograph I'd looked at before, a blurry corridor, a figure half-turned, nothing out of the ordinary except the faint smear of motion near the far wall, when it hit me, not as a thought but as a shock of clarity that cut through the noise like a struck match. The lighting in the photo was wrong. Not dim, not flickering, wrong. The shadows fell in a direction they shouldn't have, angled slightly upward instead of down, as if the source wasn't overhead but somewhere else entirely. I dropped everything and went back to the site, retracing the client's steps in the narrow passageway where the picture had been taken, and the moment I stepped inside I understood what had been gnawing at me since the start. The silence wasn't natural. It wasn't the muffled quiet of an empty building but a hollow, pressurized stillness that pushed outward instead of settling, a kind of inverted echo that tugged at the bones behind the ears. I stood in the corridor, letting the familiar details settle, the peeling paint, the uneven floor, the faint chemical scent, and then I saw it, a thin, almost imperceptible line etched into the far wall, curved in a way that didn't match the structure's geometry, a mark I'd walked past before without noticing because it looked at first like a scratch, but now, in the stillness, it seemed more like a contour drawn around something that wasn't there anymore. And suddenly the client's pauses made sense, their drifting gaze, the way they'd struggled to describe what they'd seen without letting the words land fully. They hadn't been hiding information. They'd been circling around a truth that didn't fit inside language, not without tearing something open. I leaned in close, tracing the mark with my eyes, and the air shifted, a faint tremor running through the floor like a pulse, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't supernatural, not in the storybook sense, no apparitions, no disembodied voices, but something had been here, something that bent the environment in ways too precise, too intentional, to dismiss. And whatever it was, whatever left that contour, it hadn't just observed the client. It had followed them. I felt the understanding settle cold and heavy in my chest, not a revelation but an alignment, the moment when scattered fragments finally click into a shape you'd hoped was impossible. The mystery wasn't about what happened in that hallway. It was about what had stepped out of it, and why it hadn't stopped moving since. In the end, the conclusion didn't arrive with a bang or a revelation sharp enough to split the world open. It settled slowly, like dust after a long collapse, drifting into the open spaces of my thoughts until the shape of the truth became impossible to ignore. When the final pieces slid into place, they did so quietly, almost politely, as though the case itself had grown tired of resisting and simply let me see what had been there all along. The client stood in front of me that last day looking somehow smaller, not in body but in presence, as if whatever had been trailing them had finally peeled away, leaving behind only the exhaustion of someone who had carried too much for too long. They listened as I explained what I'd found: the corridor, the impossible contour, the subtle distortions threading through their timeline like a hairline crack, and they didn't argue, didn't question. They only closed their eyes for a moment, the way people do when a burden too heavy to notice suddenly rolls off their shoulders. What exactly followed them home we never defined, not fully. Even the most careful language felt too clumsy for something that slipped between angles and hid behind the rhythm of silence. But we identified the pattern, the trigger, the point at which their life brushed against something it wasn't meant to touch. I made sure the space was sealed, the access restricted, the reports filed with just enough technical phrasing to keep the wrong eyes away. It wasn't the kind of solution that earns headlines or commendations, but it was the kind that keeps people intact, and that's enough. The client moved afterward, farther out than I expected, a quiet town with broad streets and no narrow hallways. And though we exchanged a few messages in the following weeks, their words grew lighter each time, like someone relearning how to breathe without tension coiling around their ribs. They never asked me what I thought the presence wanted, or why I had lingered. Maybe they didn't need the answer, or maybe they understood that asking would only open a door best left closed. As for the others touched by the case, the clerk who couldn't remember the missing file, the witnesses who shifted in their seats when shadows pulled near their feet, I checked in where I could. Most of them seemed unchanged on the surface, their lives sliding back into familiar grooves, but there were moments, subtle and scattered, when I saw something flicker behind their expressions, a brief confusion, a quiet hesitance, as if their memories still held a faint echo of the distortion, a residue of the wrongness that had passed so close. I told myself it would fade with time. For their sake, I hope it does. After the paperwork was done and the office quieted again, I found myself replaying the case in long, slow circuits, walking through it the way you might walk the perimeter of a crime scene after the body's gone, searching for something the chaos had obscured. I kept coming back to the mark on the corridor wall, the curve that didn't match any architectural logic, and the way the silence there seemed to lean in, a presence without form. I thought about how close I'd come to it, how the air had pressed against my skin like a breath held too long, and I wondered, not for the first time, whether some lines are meant to remain uncrossed, whether some places remember us even after we walk away. People think a case ends when you file the final report, but the truth is it lingers, settling into the spaces between moments, resurfacing when the night grows too still or when the streetlights flicker in a way that feels intentional. This one stayed with me more than most, not because of what I saw but because of what I didn't, the absence shaped like a presence, the way reality seemed to bend not outward but inward, as if something had pressed a fingertip against the world just long enough to leave a faint indent. I don't claim to understand what I brushed against in that hallway. I can dress it up in rational terms: environmental resonance, structural acoustics, psychological feedback loops, but none of those explanations account for the feeling that something watched me through the dark, something that wasn't bound to walls or angles or the rules that make places behave the way they should. But maybe that's fine. Maybe mystery, in small doses, is something the world needs in order to stay whole. Without it, everything would be too clean, too defined, too thin to survive. I sit now with the case behind me, the city humming its usual restless tune outside my window, and I feel a kind of quiet settle in my chest. Not comfort, not exactly, but acceptance. Things happened. People were changed. Something unseen stepped close enough to touch the edges of our lives, then retreated back into whatever space it calls home. And I, for better or worse, walked away with a clearer sense of the boundaries between what we know and what we only think we understand. Cases end, reports close, clients move on. but the world keeps its secrets. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, it lets you glimpse just enough of them to remind you how small you are, how little you grasp, and how much waits in the corners, patient and unbothered, for the next person who wanders too close to whatever it is that breathes just beyond the edge of reason.